This was the gate of Masada that the Romans decided to destroy. So this was where they eventually broke through. There was no ramp, as you see this. This is man-made. This is not a natural feature. So the Romans were encamped over there. You can actually see the rocks that were the outline of where they were camped all the way around the base of Masada, but that's where the general was. Okay. And from there he commanded this operation, which was to build a siege ramp all the way up so that they could attack this fort from right here at this position. It was the only place. There was no other possible place. Yeah. So this was the easiest place. There was a valley between here and that hill there, and they used Jewish slave labor to fill it in, just carry stones and rocks and fill it in until eventually it built up. It took 3 years. They were surrounding this, building this siege ramp. Eventually they got it high enough so that they could attack the gates, try to burn the gates. Actually they did. The gates were eventually burned, and then battering ram. And this is where they finally broke through. And of course, when they came in, they found that there was nobody left, no survivors. First of all, they were adamant about taking Masada because they couldn't brook any rebellion. There were nearly 1,000 people here, and of course there were women and children also. But the Romans simply could not brook any rebellion. If you allowed any rebellion, you lose your empire. So they had to rule with a fist of iron. And this position they had to take because it was the only reasonable place where they could build a siege ramp. This is one of the many cisterns where they would gather water. Notice the sides are plastered. They did that so that the water would not seep through the cracks. Okay. So this is one of the many, let's step down here, one of the many cisterns where they would gather the water and they had to store it somewhere. So there were many of these full of water. That's how they could survive 3 years of siege.
Right. Where would they get water from?
That's a good question. Let me show you. It would pour.
The sky is playing rain, you see?
And the water would run down into the hills. And they built ditches alongside the walls and the sides of the mountain. The water would run down the ditches and into the holes that you see in the side, and those holes were large cisterns in the side of the mountain. So by this, whenever it would rain, they would have the opportunity to gather water and store it in the many cisterns that were here. So this is part of the bathhouse complex. This was obviously a soaker tub. I'm assuming it was cold water because I don't think there were heating vents underneath it or in the walls. It's in an amazing condition considering the age. You can see the plaster still on the walls and on the stairs. And remember what I said about the plaster. They had to do that or the walls would just seep through the cracks. Right. And it'd be gone. So the thicker the plaster, the more it would help to retain the water and the longer it would last. Let's check out inside the bathhouse. Okay, this amazes me that the paint, the coloring on the plaster is still here and it's still vivid. I mean, it'd be really neat if the whole thing were here, but the fact that has remained to me is, I'm not sure exactly what they used for the paint or for the coloring, but it is amazing. You've got your reds, your yellows, your blues, your greens, your charcoals, white. See the plaster?
What were all these little pillars for?
These pillars held up the floor. So they would have a furnace, probably maybe right here where this was would be a furnace, or on the outside. The air would come through here, through there, but there'd be a draft. It would come, the floor was hollow. It would be tile on top of the floor, similar to what you see here. And then these clay pipes were in the walls, and they went up, and it would carry the heat up outside or through the ceiling, so that created a draft. So the hot air would come through. It would warm the floors and the walls. They'd be very hot, like a steam room or a sauna. So depending on what you wanted, you could have dry heat, you could have a sauna, or you could have your big container of water and throw water on the hot walls, and you'd have a steam room. These were very popular in Roman times, and you see a lot of these in Roman ruins wherever you go in the world.
Wow. It's amazing.
The dark line represents what they found intact. The lower portion was already intact, and the southern portion from the stones which had fallen on either side of it, and they visualized exactly where they would fit in best and pieced them together to give you what you see here today. But the rough outline was already here. So, for instance, they could tell where the doorway was, where the entryway was. This happened in 66 to 69 AD.
What's this building?
This was a dovecote.
Oh, okay.
So they kept doves here. They could use them for their eggs. They used their fertilizer for the gardens that they had planted in here, and that's where they would keep the doves or the pigeons, and utilize their eggs, their fertilizer, and if necessary, they could eat the birds. These were some of the catapult rocks that the Romans shot up here to try to batter down the walls. And they would shoot them up, the Jews would get them and roll them back down the hill. So they were deadly for both sides. They'd been rounded, they'd fit in the catapult and come into the fort. Now in this room...
Are these original stones?
Oh yeah, these are original. These are original. This is possibly the most significant room on Masada. This is where they found the potsherds, the fragments of pottery with the names written on them, which they believe was the draw when they would draw to see who would kill who would be the last man to take the lives of the others and then commit suicide.
Wow.
Because of course, the Jews didn't believe in taking innocent life.
Right.
They didn't believe in committing suicide.
Right.
So nobody really wanted to be the last guy.
Yeah.
So they wrote their names on broken pieces of pottery. And it's like drawing a name out of the hat. They'd shake them up and they'd draw a name. Okay, you're the man. So this is where they found those, right in this area. In this room, they found fragments of scrolls that were written in Hebrew, which was, of course, exciting to them because it gave proof that the Jewish people were here in this place. This is called the Casement of the Scrolls. Thousands of Roman soldiers were encamped here. You would hear the sound of them yelling, singing, cursing, joking, laughing, building. This is a very special place for Jews. It represents their coming back, and their saying is, Masada shall not fall again. They have swearing in ceremonies for soldiers up here. These were the storage rooms. All of these be filled with barley, wheat, whatever they needed, whatever food.
How many people lived up here?
Well, I mean, there were 1,000 people, nearly 1,000 people here for 3 years, right? And when they started doing the excavations here, they actually found grain in some of these storage rooms. They actually found grain, and it was still good. It was still workable. It was still fertile. Planted it, and it grew.
That's amazing. Really?
So grain that was 2,000 years old, and regardless of how old it was, it grew. You know, Jesus said, "Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit." And of course, as we've explained earlier, the KJV uses the word corn, except a corn of grain. They didn't have corn as we know it. Corn came from North America. It meant except a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die. So what they found here was 2,000 years old. When they planted it, it worked. Don't let anybody tell you that the Bible is so old-fashioned that it doesn't work anymore. Yes, it's 2,000 years old, and parts of it are 3,000 years old. We've got the record of the Old Testament, but it's still alive. If it's planted, it will grow. Our job's to plant it, preserve it, and plant it. This is what they found when they came up here to excavate. All of these looked like this. So the walls existed to a certain height, and that's what you see the black lines on the walls for. But when they came in to excavate, this is what they found. So they have to go through these stone by stone, piece by piece, try to figure out, all right, which wall did this fall from? Where does this go? And then they piece them together to make the restored part of the walls like you see today. That really doesn't look like fun work, does it?
No.
We think of the exciting finds in archaeology, but that just doesn't look very fun. But that's how they put these back together.
Yeah.
We've just come into the northern part of Herod's palace. This is the top part. It's on the northern side of the hill of Masada. And his palace was built in 3 levels. This was the upper level. You can see here a model of what it must have looked like based on the archaeological remains with the top level, the middle level, and the bottom level. We'll walk down there in a little while. I think it's about 200 stairs down, and remember, what goes down must come up. So from here you get a good view also of the walls and the forts around the base of Masada. Obviously, of course, built like this, it could catch the breeze. So it helped make the summer days a little bit more endurable. Directly below us is the middle portion of his palace, and then the lower portion down there. You can see the wall now. There's the fort we were looking at from the gate that was breached. And you can see the wall goes to the edge of the cliff there. You can see it down the bottom. That wall went all the way around. There's another fort. So they had bases or forts. They had walls and they had towers. That wall was originally 18 feet high all the way around.
Really?
The fact that that much survives after 2,000 years is witness to how strong and how big it was built at the time.
Right.
So you can see piles, concentrated piles of stones. Every now and then, that's where a tower was.
Oh, okay.
So they'd have a watchtower,
Yeah.
wall, watchtower, wall, watchtower, wall, watchtower, wall, watchtower, wall, watchtower, wall, watchtower. You see that?
Yeah.
So they were fairly evenly spaced. And you can imagine, now you can see why did they choose the other side to build the ramp. because they already had a head start.
Right.
Yeah,
How would you do it from here?
it's been very difficult.
Yeah, that would take more
You
than
just
3
couldn't
years.
do it.
That's amazing. They were camped out here for a long time.
That's why these bases are still existent. See over there?
Yeah.
Because they were here. It was like a temporary barracks, but they had to make it as permanent as possible and as impregnable as possible. So somehow, some way, they had water coming into this. It looks like they had it close enough to be accessible from the middle terrace of the palace. This is the middle terrace.
Okay.
This was the center
Right.
part of his palace. I think the top portion and the bottom portion were probably the most extravagant, but it's hard to tell. All right. The walls went way up. See the plaster way up there?
Yeah.
So this was not just a tiny thing. It was huge. It was massive. They used whatever they had, and they incorporated the palace into the landscape. And I think that it's amazing that these plastered walls and colors are still here. Look at that. Rocks and sand and dirt had accumulated. So all these colors that you see probably were totally covered up, and they discovered them as they excavated this area. You know, there were 2,000 years worth of refuse here, dust and dirt and mud and stone and erosion. Imagine what would happen in your city if nobody ever cleaned the streets or swept the sidewalks or cleaned the yards. For 2,000 years, what would your city look like? You know?
Yeah.
It would cease to be recognizable. So across the valley are the mountains of Moab.
Okay.
This was Moab.
Okay.
Ammon was to the north. Edom was to the south. So Edom was down here. Moab was across here. Ammon was up there. So that's where the Edomites, Moabites, and the Ammonites were.
I see.
Helps you to kind of put in perspective when you're reading, instead of reading a bunch of ites,
Yeah.
you can say, okay, that's where they were, that's where they were, that's where they
Get a
were.
better perspective.